In September 1987, 50-year-old Dale Kerstetter vanished from his job during an overnight shift at the Corning Glassworks plant in Bradford, Pennsylvania. On that very same night, more than $250,000 worth of platinum disappeared from the facility. And yes, if you're a longtime viewer, you know that I have a keen interest in both heists and missing persons cases, so I couldn't pass this one up. Kerstetter was a veteran maintenance man and security guard with 27 years' experience at the Corning plant. He was scheduled to work his usual night shift on Saturday, September 12th, 1987. By the next morning, he was gone without a trace, leaving behind personal belongings and a mystery that endures to this day. Investigators and family alike have grappled with the question: was Dale Kerstetter an unsuspecting victim of a robbery, or a willing participant in an elaborate theft? Dale was a trusted employee described as an ordinary, well-liked man devoted to his large family. Sometime during the night, approximately $250,000 worth of platinum pipe used in the glass manufacturing process went missing from the plant's furnace area, along with Kerstetter himself. When the next security guard, John Lindquist, showed up at 7 a.m. on Sunday to relieve Dale, he immediately sensed something was wrong. Kerstetter was nowhere to be found at his post. In the plant's cafeteria, Lindquist discovered Dale's lunch pail sitting on a table alongside his newspaper and keys. This was an alarming sign, as it appeared Dale had left in the middle of his shift without even consuming the dinner he brought. Later that morning, security staff located Kerstetter's pickup truck, still in the plant parking lot, yielding more puzzling clues. The truck's keys were still in the ignition, and inside the vehicle, investigators found a full carton of cigarettes, Dale's food, and an empty holster for his weapon, which itself was missing. There were no indications of forced entry at the plant, or signs of a struggle at the scene. These early clues suggested that whatever happened, it occurred suddenly, and likely not at Kerstetter's own initiative. For example, Dale was a heavy smoker, so leaving behind an entire carton of cigarettes was highly unusual if he had intended to leave voluntarily. Plant procedures also called for the lone night guard to check in by phone with the company's headquarters every hour. However, it was later discovered that Dale never made any hourly check-in calls after starting his shift. Unfortunately, a new employee in the remote monitoring office wasn't familiar with this protocol, so Kerstetter's missed check-ins went unnoticed in real time. Once Kerstetter's disappearance was recognized, plant officials and authorities quickly launched a search of the sprawling facility and surrounding area. And when I say sprawling here, I'm not exaggerating. The facility itself is over 100,000 square feet, and the property it's on is even larger. Fearing that the missing guard might have been injured or fallen ill on the job, a K-9 unit was brought in to track his scent through the building. The bloodhounds traced Dale's trail along his normal patrol route at first, then led officers to the second-floor area housing the plant's glass furnace, where the valuable platinum was kept. This location wasn't part of Kerstetter's usual rounds, raising a red flag that something drew him there during the night. Upon inspecting the furnace, managers discovered that several pieces of platinum lining had been cut out and removed, confirming that a major theft had occurred. Despite an extensive search of the building, no sign of Kerstetter was found inside, and a sweep of the surrounding woods and a nearby creek also turned up nothing. By later that day, the McKean County Sheriff's Office and Pennsylvania State Police were treating the incident as both a missing person case and a high-value burglary. A breakthrough in the early investigation came when officials reviewed the plant's security camera footage. About 4 days after the incident, Corning personnel manager Patrick Foley scrutinized recordings from 3 surveillance cameras that monitored the facility. Also, keep Foley's name in mind for later, because he's going to come up again in a bit, and depending on how you see this case, you'll either love or hate him. What Foley saw was startling and completely changed the nature of the case and the investigation. At approximately 10:40 p.m., only minutes after Kerstetter started his shift, the footage showed a masked intruder walking through the back area of the plant. At around 10:45 p.m., the cameras captured a brief encounter between Dale and this masked person in a corridor. Kerstetter could be seen walking up to the intruder and apparently engaging in a short conversation. The two then moved together out of frame. Moments later, the intruder is seen walking through the plant alone, without Kerstetter. The next significant footage comes around midnight, when the intruder appears on camera in the furnace area on the second floor, precisely where the platinum was stored. The video shows the intruder in that area, and later shows him wheeling out a large, heavy bag through the building. Investigators speculated that the bag likely contained the stolen platinum, or possibly even Kerstetter himself. Notably, during the brief corridor encounter on the tape, as Kerstetter and the masked man were leaving the second floor area together, Dale glances up directly into one of the security cameras. This peculiar moment would become a focal point of debate. Was Dale subtly looking into the camera to signal for help, or was he acknowledging the camera Jim from The Office style, because he knew what was about to happen? Authorities at the time couldn't determine if Kerstetter's behavior indicated duress or complicity. The surveillance evidence made one thing clear: the unidentified intruder was able to navigate the plant with confidence. The individual knew exactly where to find the platinum, how to access the furnace, even in the dark, and where equipment like carts or bags were located. This strongly suggested that someone familiar with the facility, perhaps a current or former employee, was involved in the heist. Notably, while the authorities have been uncertain about whether Dale was involved, the company he worked for 27 years of his life literally immediately threw him under the bus. Patrick Foley, the plant manager I mentioned previously, went on the record saying that Dale was a common thief taking their platinum. Also, as a complete aside, I hope Mr. Foley's words inspire someone to take this as a sign to follow their own dreams. By way of reminder, Dale gave 27 years of service to Corning Glassworks. Yet this was the thanks he got at the end of the day, where there was a significant likelihood that he was slain in the line of duty. Dale's family vehemently rejected the notion that Dale was a platinum thief from the beginning. Family members described Kerstetter as a devoted father of 6, who would never willingly abandon his children and grandchildren without any word. In the months and years following the disappearance, the case remained a stubborn mystery. Law enforcement conducted numerous interviews and background checks. It came to light that Kerstetter had been under financial strain. He'd recently taken a pay cut of several $1,000s and was reportedly $40,000 behind on various loan and bill payments. This information gave weight to a possible motive if he had engineered the theft. Investigators also noted that no trace of the missing platinum or Dale himself surfaced in the aftermath. The platinum, a highly valuable commodity, could have been melted down or sold on a black market, making it hard to trace. Meanwhile, despite occasional tips, police never identified the masked culprit seen on the tape. The uncertainty of Kerstetter's fate created legal and personal dilemmas for his family. In 1990, 3 years after he vanished, Dale's daughter Wendy petitioned the court to have her father declared legally dead. She was hoping to bring some closure and possibly claim life insurance and his pension benefits. Corning Glassworks fought this petition, contending that Dale could still be alive and may have been a participant in the crime. During the hearing, the company's lawyer argued there was no conclusive evidence that Kerstetter had met with foul play. The Pennsylvania Superior Court agreed that the evidence of Dale's demise was too vague and denied the petition in December 1990. As a result, Kerstetter remained legally a missing person, and Corning withheld his pension and insurance payouts from his family. Over the years, several theories have emerged to explain what might have happened to Dale Kerstetter. The core question is whether Kerstetter was an unwilling victim of foul play, or whether he was a willing participant in the theft who disappeared by choice. Within these broad possibilities are variations, including the idea that he could have been involved in the crime, but ultimately double-crossed and harmed by accomplices. Each theory has its own evidence and arguments, with strengths and weaknesses supported by the known facts. One prominent theory is that Dale Kerstetter was the victim of foul play, meaning he encountered intruders during a robbery and was forcibly taken and slain. In this scenario, criminals, possibly one or more people, broke into the plant to steal the platinum and neutralize the security guard as an obstacle. Supporting evidence for this theory centers on indications that Kerstetter didn't leave on his own terms. The scene left behind at the plant strongly suggests an abrupt interruption. Investigators found no signs of a struggle at the guard station, but it's possible that the confrontation was quick, explaining the lack of obvious violence on the premises. After all, the thieves would have had strong motivation to be as silent as possible. The fact that his weapon was missing from its holster implies he might have armed himself when facing a threat, or that the intruder took his weapon from him. On the security tape, Kerstetter's behavior could be interpreted as that of a man under duress. The other main line of speculation is that Kerstetter was involved in the crime. In this view, the incident was an inside job, and the masked intruder could have been an accomplice or co-conspirator rather than an unknown assailant. Proponents of this theory emphasize Kerstetter's possible motive and the inside knowledge required to carry out the theft. Investigators uncovered that Dale was under significant financial pressure, including tens of thousands of dollars in debt and a recent pay cut at work. Some have suggested that this pay cut after 27 years, alongside his mounting debt, could have forced a good loyal worker to turn bad. While the inside job theory is plausible, there are significant challenges and counter-arguments that cast doubt on Kerstetter's willing complicity. The most major point is Dale's abrupt and total disappearance. Even if he initially escaped, can we believe that for decades he never contacted any of his loved ones or resurfaced? However, supporters of the theory that he was in on it speculate that Dale was double-crossed by his co-conspirator. In assessing the competing theories, it's important to note that none of them have been proven. Simply put, this is a case with an abundance of strange evidence but little definitive proof. Personally, I have significant difficulty believing that a family man who worked for a company for 27 years would throw it all away for a platinum heist. I wasn't able to find the value of his pension in my research. That said, I suspect that the value of his pension after 27 years' work was likely worth more than the platinum he allegedly stole. However, to put things in perspective, the company fought tooth and nail to deny his heirs any rights to the pension, and last I checked, lawyers aren't free. This is doubly true considering he would have at least had to split it 50-50 with his accomplice, assuming there was only one. Further yet, I suspect Dale Kerstetter may not have had ready access to a fence, given that he clearly wasn't living a life of crime. He would have had to have taken a massive hit on the exchange of the illicit platinum. In my view, the numbers just don't really add up, and I'd like to propose a theory I haven't run into so far. Dale was known to be the only person who worked security at the plant where the platinum was kept. It would have been extremely easy for a perpetrator to follow him back to his house, snap a few pictures, and then confront him at a different location. At this point, he would have been given an offer he couldn't refuse, and we know from his family that he was a loving family man with 6 kids, plus grandkids. I think he could have been forced to do the whole thing, and that last look at the security camera was a knowing goodbye. I admit this is purely speculation, but in my view it fits better with the evidence than him willingly throwing away significant pension-based wealth for this heist. Anyway, I've gone on way too long about Dale Kerstetter's case, but I find his case endlessly fascinating. Let me know what theory you prefer in the comments or propose your own. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with a reminder to hit that notification bell and share this video with 2 people you know. Sharing my videos helps my channel grow in a big way, and the best part is it's totally free and only takes a second. In November 1980, 26-year-old Valerie McDonald, an aspiring actress and part-time model, vanished from San Francisco under mysterious circumstances. She was last seen on November 9, 1980, leaving her North Beach apartment with a young man who had promised her a bit part in a movie. On the day she disappeared, Valerie was in the process of moving out of her apartment and had been wary of the new building managers, who were ex-convicts. That afternoon, one of them, Michael John Hennessy, convinced her to accompany him by offering $200 for a small role in a supposed Dustin Hoffman film being shot that night. Friends grew concerned when Valerie didn't return and contacted police the next day. However, they were initially told they had to wait 72 hours to file a missing persons report. Valerie's friends spent days searching for her and eventually reached out to Valerie's parents. The parents flew to San Francisco, only to be brushed off by authorities who speculated that their daughter might have gone to Las Vegas. It wasn't until roughly a week after Valerie's disappearance that police truly began investigating, and by then, critical time had been lost. Once the San Francisco police delved into the case, suspicion quickly focused on the men running Valerie's building. These were Michael Hennessy and his 2 associates, John Abbott and Philip Thompson. Investigators learned these 3 had taken over management of the apartment that fall, and all were recently out of prison. On November 19, 1980, about 10 days after Valerie went missing, authorities went to question the trio, only to discover they had abruptly vanished. A break in the case came a week later in Canada. On November 26, 1980, Abbott and Hennessy resurfaced in British Columbia, where they were confronted by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. During this encounter, Hennessy was eliminated by the police, while Abbott was captured after attempting to shoot 2 Mounties. In Abbott's vehicle and belongings, officers found multiple weapons and personal items of Valerie's, including her ID cards and the leather jacket she had been wearing on November 9th. These chilling discoveries confirmed that Valerie had been in the men's company and strongly suggested foul play. Authorities also learned that Philip Thompson had been with Abbott and Hennessy in Canada, but had flown back to California shortly before the shootout. Despite the evidence linking the suspects to Valerie's disappearance, there was still no trace of Valerie herself. Without a body, a weapon, or any direct evidence of foul play, San Francisco police felt they lacked enough proof to charge Abbott or Thompson at the time. Abbott was instead prosecuted in Canada for the attempted shooting of the officers and sentenced to prison there. Thompson was later arrested in California in 1983 on unrelated kidnapping and robbery charges. Despite tantalizing circumstantial evidence, Valerie's case unfortunately went cold. Philip Thompson and John Abbott denied any involvement in Valerie's disappearance, and with one suspect dead and the others behind bars on other matters, leads grew cold. A major break finally came over a decade later. In October 1991, hunters in a remote area of Ferry County, Washington, not far from the Canada-US border, stumbled upon partial skeletal remains near the Kettle River. The remains were initially recorded as an unidentified Jane Doe. At the time, forensic examiners could only determine that they belonged to a woman in her mid-20s to 30s. Finally, in late 2000, a review of dental records in California's missing persons database yielded a hit. In November 2001, authorities announced that the remains were identified as Valerie McDonald. The authorities officially determined that she had been rendered deceased non-consensually, confirming what her family and investigators had long suspected. The location of the grim find, along a river in Washington state, strongly tied her death to the suspect's flight path toward Canada. This discovery, 2 decades after Valerie vanished, provided some closure to her family, even as the question of who was responsible remained unanswered. Despite the strong circumstantial case against the trio, no one has ever been charged or prosecuted in this case. By the time Valerie's remains were identified in 2001, one suspect, Hennessy, was long dead, and another, Thompson, was incarcerated for life on a different slaying. The third, John Abbott, was living overseas and out of reach. After he was released from Canadian prison for his role in the shootout, he was deported to the United Kingdom, his home country. From there, he's lived in Japan, New Zealand, and South Africa. He's never faced any charges whatsoever in relation to Valerie's case, and some theories online suggest that his dad is a politically powerful individual and pulled some strings. That said, I was only able to find this information in forum gossip, so I'd take that all with a grain of salt for the time being. In December 1993, Waterloo, Iowa was rocked by two brutal slayings that continue to confound investigators and haunt the local community. Two elderly residents, 83-year-old Gladys Held and 87-year-old Jacob Barretts, were found dead in their own apartments on consecutive nights. These cases, marked by striking similarities in method and timing, have led many to suspect a single, elusive criminal may be responsible. Despite extensive investigations and modern forensic advances, the truth behind these acts remains a mystery. On the night of December 8, 1993, Gladys Held, a retired secretary, was attacked in her apartment at the Walnut Court Retirement Community at 315 Walnut Street. The following morning, when a concerned resident discovered that Gladys had missed her daily in-house service, alarm bells were raised. Initially, staff suspected that she may have had a medical emergency in the night. Responding officers found her lying in bed in disarray, with belongings scattered around the room. Evidence indicated that Gladys had been struck with her telephone and then strangled to death. Investigators later noted that Gladys's door was left unlocked and that a broken glass panel on an exterior door hinted at forced entry. A neighbor had even reported an unknown man entering an apartment the previous night and demanding money before retreating when refused. Although nothing of significant value appeared to have been stolen, the signs pointed to a burglary that escalated into a horrific act. The shocking nature of the crime left residents of Walnut Court fearful for their own safety, prompting the building's management to hire private security and urge tenants to remain vigilant. Less than 24 hours after the slaying of Gladys Held, another tragedy struck only a few blocks away. Jacob Barretts, affectionately known as Old Jake by locals, was found dead in his apartment at 311 Lafayette Street on the morning of December 10, 1993. Barretts, a retired auto mechanic who lived a quiet and solitary life, had already experienced a violent incident 2 weeks earlier during Thanksgiving weekend. In that previous home invasion, his apartment door was kicked in, and an assailant, described as a man dressed entirely in black, pepper-sprayed and brutally beat him before stealing cash. Adding to the eerie connection between this act and the later slayings, part of this brutal assault included an attempt to strangle Jake. Jake advised the authorities that he had recently gotten into a dispute with a cab driver over what he believed to be unfair charges on a trip back to his apartment from a bar. Although Jake survived that attack, the scars of the assault were a painful reminder of the dangers he faced. On the night of December 9th, a neighbor noticed unusual activity near Barretts' apartment, reportedly observing a man wandering the complex and hearing a disturbance later that evening. When this neighbor and the landlady checked on Jake the next morning, they found him on his couch with his arms neatly crossed over his chest. The autopsy later determined that he had died from asphyxia caused by suffocation, likely the result of being smothered with a pillow. Unlike the extremely violent struggle in Held's apartment, Baretz's scene appeared controlled, almost as though the perpetrator had taken time to stage the scene. Given that Jake had already been targeted in a robbery, many began to wonder if the same criminal had returned to finish the job. The close timing and geographical proximity of these two slayings immediately raised suspicions that they might be the work of a single perpetrator. The two apartment buildings are situated only a few blocks apart, and both crimes occurred during the night. Although the exact details of each crime differ slightly, the overall pattern indicates that the perp might have been targeting vulnerable elderly residents, possibly with the intent to commit robbery. Police eventually began to treat the crimes as connected, and by 2005, officials were openly stating their belief that one man was behind both crimes. From the outset, the investigations into these slayings faced significant obstacles. Both cases yielded very few leads, and despite an intensive police effort, no eyewitnesses came forward with any definitive information. Forensic teams collected blood samples, hair fibers, and trace evidence from both scenes. Yet, no usable fingerprints were found, suggesting that the perp may have taken precautions, such as wearing gloves. Although DNA profiling was still emerging as an investigative tool at the time, the samples collected from both crime scenes have yet to match any known offender in the state database. And one question I had, and I'm sure you do too, is whether these two DNA samples match with one another. Well, I hate to break it to you, but the answer isn't readily available. That said, reading between the lines, you'll recall that in 2005, the cops said, "They think it was the same guy. I think that's confirmation that the DNA from the scenes matches." All that said, the lack of a DNA match to a database continues to be one of the major stumbling blocks in solving these cases. The limited physical evidence was compounded by the absence of clear eyewitness testimony. In the case of Gladys Held, aside from a neighbor's report of a suspicious intruder demanding money, no one witnessed the crime. Similarly, although a neighbor reported hearing disturbances at Jacob Baretz's apartment, by the time anyone arrived, the assailant had already vanished into the night. In January 1994, Gladys Held's son even offered a reward for information that could lead to an arrest, but this too failed to produce any tangible leads. As a result, police were left with only circumstantial evidence to pursue, and despite periodic reviews by cold case units in later years, the perpetrator has never been identified. The scarcity of definitive evidence has given rise to numerous speculative theories about who might be behind these acts. One of the most popular ideas is that a single criminal was targeting elderly residents in Waterloo. Proponents of this theory point to the vulnerability of the victims and the methodical nature of the crimes as evidence that the assailant was experienced and calculated in his approach. According to this view, the perpetrator deliberately chose seniors who lived alone, making them easy targets for a burglary that quickly escalated. Another theory that has received significant attention centers on the individual implicated in Jacob Baretz's earlier robbery. Baretz had expressed suspicion that a particular cab driver was responsible for his brutal assault during Thanksgiving weekend. Although this taxi driver theory is intriguing, law enforcement has never publicly confirmed a strong link between him and either crime. Beyond the main theories, alternative ideas have circulated among amateur sleuths. Some speculate that the acts were not solely crimes of opportunity, but part of a broader plan to instill fear in the community. A few online theorists have suggested that the perpetrator might have been emboldened by what he perceived as lax security measures in senior housing. These theorists suggest this enabled him to target vulnerable residents with minimal risk of detection. Although there's little evidence to support a personal vendetta or a message-driven motive, this possibility adds yet another layer of complexity to these cases. Personally, I think the best chance for resolution of these cases is through genetic genealogy. The perpetrator's DNA has been cataloged, and these days, even if he isn't in a database, so long as one of his relatives wants to know what percentage Irish they are, he'll be caught. In late September 1982, a shocking crime spree in the Chicago area left 7 people dead after they unwittingly consumed Tylenol painkillers laced with deadly potassium cyanide. The victims ranged in age from 12-year-old Mary Kellerman to 35-year-old Paula Prince, all who collapsed suddenly after taking what they thought was ordinary extra-strength Tylenol. The mysterious poisoning deaths triggered nationwide fear, a massive product recall, and one of the largest investigations in American history. On the morning of September 29, 1982, news began to spread that several people in the Chicago area had mysteriously died after taking Tylenol. Mary Kellerman, age 12, had been rushed to the hospital the day before with a sudden illness and died after taking Tylenol for a cold. That same day, Adam Janus, 27, also passed away, again after taking the medication. Tragically, Adam's brother Stanley Janus, 25, and sister-in-law Teresa Janus, 20, died soon after, all having taken pills from the same Tylenol bottle at Adam's home. Within a short span, Mary Reiner, 27, Mary McFarland, 31, and Paula Prince, 35, also fell victim to cyanide-laced Tylenol capsules. In total, at least 7 people lost their lives in the Chicago area before authorities recognized the common link. Local officials and medical professionals acted swiftly once the connection to Tylenol was suspected. A nurse named Helen Jensen played a key early role. She visited the Janus family home, noted their Tylenol bottle had been recently purchased and had 6 pills missing, and alerted investigators that the painkillers might be the cause. A Cook County medical examiner, hearing this information, had a hunch the culprit was cyanide and told the investigators it emits an almond odor. Investigators opened a suspicious Tylenol capsule and detected the almond-like smell, and lab tests soon confirmed that several Tylenol capsules contained potassium cyanide, a fast-acting poison. This rapid forensic discovery, essentially basic toxicology and keen observation, was crucial in preventing many more deaths. Authorities immediately held a press conference to warn the public not to consume any Tylenol products for the time being. The response from both government and the manufacturer was sweeping. Within days, Johnson & Johnson issued an urgent product recall. The recall was initially focused on the suspected lot of Tylenol capsules and then rapidly expanded to all Tylenol extra-strength capsules in the Chicago area. As more tainted bottles were found across different stores and even different Tylenol lot numbers, the recall widened to eventually include 31 million bottles of Tylenol nationwide. The company halted all Tylenol production and advertising, and it instructed consumers nationwide to avoid Tylenol capsules until the scope of the tampering could be determined. This quick action and clear warnings are often credited with preventing further loss of life. By early October, Tylenol had been completely pulled off store shelves, and law enforcement agencies at every level were mobilized to hunt for the person, or persons, responsible. The investigation into the Tylenol case became a massive, multi-agency effort involving local police departments, the Illinois State Police, the FBI, and the FDA. Early forensic evidence pointed to how the crime was committed. The poisoned Tylenol capsules came from different production plants. This meant it was highly unlikely the tampering occurred during manufacturing, a fact which greatly limited the geographic scope of the investigation. Instead, police hypothesized that the perpetrator purchased several bottles of Tylenol from various stores around Chicago, The perpetrator is then thought to have added cyanide to some of the capsules and then returned the resealed bottles to store shelves for unsuspecting customers to buy. This theory fit the scattered geography of the incidents, as tainted bottles were found at multiple pharmacies and grocery stores in the Chicago area. It also explained why only certain bottles were deadly, rather than entire production lots. It also meant the perpetrator had to physically visit those stores in the days or weeks prior to the deaths, which gave investigators a rough timeline and locations to scrutinize. With no immediate suspect, investigators turned to both old-fashioned police work as well as some new innovative tactics. Chicago police and the FBI conducted countless interviews and followed up on leads about anyone buying or possessing cyanide. At the FBI's suggestion, an unusual sting operation was attempted in early 1983. Columnist Bob Greene of the Chicago Tribune published a story with the home address and graveyard location of Mary Kellerman, the youngest victim. The idea was to provoke the perpetrator into visiting either the family's home or the gravesite, perhaps out of guilt or twisted curiosity. Both locations were placed under 24-hour video surveillance for months, but the suspect never showed up. Investigators also released to the media a surveillance photo from a drugstore security camera that showed victim Paula Prince buying her Tylenol. In the background of the photo, a mysterious bearded man is seen watching her. Police publicly labeled that unknown bearded man as a possible suspect, hoping someone might identify him. Others have observed that Paula Prince was a conventionally attractive young woman who likely attracted unwanted stares and gazes fairly routinely. Despite these efforts, the man was never identified. A major early break in the investigation was the emergence of a prime suspect through an unexpected source: an extortion letter. On October 1st, 1982, Johnson & Johnson received a letter from someone claiming responsibility for the poisonings and demanding $1 million to stop the carnage. Law enforcement treated the letter seriously and traced it to a man named James William Lewis, a 36-year-old who had once lived in the Chicago area. Lewis quickly became the focus of the investigation. A nationwide manhunt ensued, and Lewis, along with his wife Leanne, was eventually arrested in New York City in December 1982. With Lewis in custody, investigators hoped they had their man. Lewis didn't emerge from nowhere, and he had a checkered past that drew law enforcement attention even before the Tylenol case. Born in Missouri, Lewis worked as an accountant in the 1970s. In 1978, he was charged in Kansas City with the slaying of a 72-year-old client, Raymond West. Lewis was suspected of the crime after fingerprints, later identified as his, were found on some evidence. However, the charges were later dismissed as some evidence had been obtained illegally, undermining the case. This meant Lewis walked free, but the incident established his history of serious run-ins with the law. By the early 1980s, James and his wife Leanne had spent time in Chicago, and Lewis had also been accused of fraud, for which the couple reportedly fled the area prior to the Tylenol incidents. But let's get back to the extortion letter itself for a moment. The author of the letter claimed responsibility for the 7 deaths and instructed that the money be deposited in a particular bank account. Investigators traced the bank account to a Chicago bank and discovered it belonged to a former employer of James Lewis's wife. Lewis later admitted he wrote the letter, saying he never intended to collect any money himself. Rather, he wanted to direct suspicion toward his wife's former boss by having the money sent to that person's account. In other words, Lewis claimed the extortion attempt was a hoax, a way to frame someone else out of vindictiveness, rather than an admission that he was actually the Tylenol poisoner. Now let me just take a moment here to discuss my own theory. If he was the one responsible, he may have planned on doing some form of violence to his former wife's boss to get access to that money. After all, if this former employer was to disappear after withdrawing the cash, investigators would have had to investigate the possibility that he left the country with the money. Notably, this also provided plausible deniability to a much lesser crime should he be caught. In essence, I think it may have been a scheme to strike it rich, with a built-in insurance policy that potentially allowed him to escape responsibility for the truly horrific poisoning crimes. Upon arrest, Lewis didn't confess to the poisonings. However, he did do something rather intriguing. He gave investigators a detailed account of how theoretically the perp might have carried out the poisonings. Anyway, for reasons that should be obvious to everyone watching, I'm not going to go into the details he provided to the authorities. That said, in essence, he gave them a tutorial on how to tamper with the bottles without anyone noticing. Of course, this was all conjecture according to him, and not in any way tied to reality. Authorities later found that he also owned a book which contained instructions for manufacturing poisons, which I'm sure he claimed was just reference material. Adding to suspicion, his fingerprints were very lightly found throughout the book, except in one area, the cyanide part. Despite all this, investigators never found enough evidence to actually bring charges directly in relation to the Tylenol tamperings. They were, however, able to prosecute him for the crime related to the letter itself. In 1983, Lewis was put on trial in federal court for attempting to extort $1 million from Johnson & Johnson by threatening further violence. During the trial, his defense team repeated Lewis's claim that he only wrote the letter to draw attention to someone else, his wife's ex-employer, and never intended to harm anyone. This claim didn't exonerate him in the eyes of the court for the act of sending the threat, which seems rather unsurprising to me. He was convicted of extortion and received a sentence of 10 years in federal prison. It's worth noting that throughout his imprisonment, and indeed for the rest of his life, James Lewis steadfastly maintained that he was not the Tylenol tamperer. He remains the only person to have ever been convicted in relation to the case. Another suspect investigated in relation to the case was Roger Arnold, a local dock worker. Arnold had allegedly bragged about having cyanide and made suspicious comments about his involvement while drinking at a bar. Police learned that Arnold worked with the father of one of the victims, Mary Reiner, which tied him to the case. Investigators detained Arnold for questioning multiple times, but they never found enough evidence to charge him in relation to the poisonings. In the 2010s, after both Lewis and Arnold had passed, their DNA was tested against potential DNA of the perpetrator found on one or some of the bottles. Unfortunately, since this is an active and ongoing investigation, the authorities haven't released whether the same person's DNA was found on all the bottles. Indeed, if the same DNA was found on 2 or more bottles, it appears to me to be extremely likely that that DNA is definitely that of the perpetrator. While the perpetrator still hasn't been caught, I'm somewhat confident that genetic genealogy may one day crack the case, depending on the nature of the DNA evidence on the bottles. Also, as a side note, the seals we crack on a new medication bottle are a direct result of this tragedy. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with a reminder to hit that notification bell and share this video with 2 people you know. Sharing my videos with your friends and family and on your socials is the best way you can help my channel grow, and the best part is it's entirely free. In February 1998, a 20-year-old Canadian college student named Stephen Vincent Milan vanished under puzzling circumstances. What began as a late-night drive from his home in Mississauga, Ontario, turned into a cross-border mystery when his car was discovered over 2,000 miles away in Arizona. Stephen Milan was a business student at Humber College's North Campus in Toronto and lived with his family in Mississauga. On the night of February 13th, 1998, just after midnight, he left home driving his black 1991 Chevrolet Beretta. He had recently told relatives that he wanted to travel to the United States to obtain a medication for hair loss. At the time, a new prescription hair loss drug had just come on the market in the US, which may explain his interest in a cross-border trip. Whatever his true intentions, Stephen drove off alone that night and was never seen or heard from again. The first clue in Stephen's disappearance came at the US-Canada border. American customs records showed that his vehicle crossed into the United States at the Rainbow Bridge border crossing at Niagara Falls on February 14, 1998. Notably, this was the day after he left home, and the drive from Mississauga to Niagara Falls only takes about an hour. Importantly, it hasn't been confirmed that Stephen himself was in the car at that time. No witnesses recalled seeing him, and the border log simply noted the car's license plate, not the occupants of the vehicle. When he failed to return or contact his family, they reported him missing to the Peel Regional Police in Ontario. Investigators now had an international missing person case on their hands, with the last trace of Stephen being his car's entry into the States. From the outset, law enforcement treated Stephen's disappearance as unusual. Peel Regional Police began a missing person investigation and reached out to U.S. authorities once the border crossing was discovered. For a time, there were no further leads on Stephen's whereabouts. Then, in a startling development, his car was found abandoned in Arizona only days after he went missing. According to reports, a local spotted Stephen's black Chevy parked at an overlook at the Grand Canyon sometime in mid-February. The car's keys were still in the ignition, and there was no sign of the driver. Rather than immediately notify police, the man who found the empty car decided to take it for himself and use it. He drove Stephen's vehicle around northern Arizona for a few months. Eventually, the car broke down, and he left it parked off State Route 64 near Flagstaff. On June 8, 1998, nearly 4 months after Stephen's disappearance, authorities finally recovered the car. It was found stripped of parts and abandoned off the highway in Flagstaff, roughly an hour's drive from where it had originally been spotted at the Grand Canyon overlook. When police traced the vehicle identification and plate, they realized it belonged to the missing Canadian student. American law enforcement interviewed the individual who had taken the car. He readily admitted he stumbled upon the empty vehicle at the Grand Canyon overlook and kept it, but claimed to know nothing about Stephen's fate. This person's actions were both illegal and highly unusual. As many internet sleuths have noted, finding a car with the keys in it and simply deciding to steal it is a bizarre twist in an already strange case. That said, there was no evidence linking the car thief to Stephen, aside from the vehicle itself. With the location of Stephen's car pinpointed, a coordinated search effort was launched in the area. The spot where the car had initially been found, the remote Little Colorado Gorge overlook located on Navajo land, was searched extensively on foot and by helicopter. Searchers scoured the canyon rim and the rugged terrain below for any trace of the missing student. Despite these extensive ground and aerial searches, no sign of Stephen was found. The Peel Regional Police completed their standard investigation steps and continued to monitor the case, but by the end of 1998, there were no solid clues pointing to what happened. One theory is that Stephen traveled all the way to northern Arizona and met with an accident near the canyon. The fact that his keys were left in the ignition suggests he may have stopped briefly and intended to return. It's possible he ventured near the canyon's edge and suffered a fall. However, an intensive search of the area below the overlook turned up no indication of his whereabouts. If he did fall into the canyon, one would expect some evidence to be discovered, but nothing was found. Another variant of this theory suggests that he may have gone down the gorge willingly, but again, this runs into the same evidentiary issues. To this day, there is no proof that Stephen's remains are in the Grand Canyon, leaving this theory unconfirmed. Another possibility is that Stephen encountered foul play after arriving at the Grand Canyon. The remote location where his car was abandoned could have made him vulnerable to a robbery or attack. Perhaps he crossed paths with the wrong person and met with violence, after which the perpetrator left his car with the keys inside to cover their tracks. No signs of a struggle were reported in the vehicle, but without proper forensic evidence, I don't see how the authorities could possibly rule this out. And I think it's important to remember here that the vehicle was used for months, and we really have no idea what happened with it during that time. If there were signs of a struggle, it's always possible that the car thief, even if he wasn't actually involved in any more serious criminal act, had the car cleaned up. After all, he clearly intended to treat it as his vehicle at least for a little while. If there was evidence of a crime in a stolen vehicle he was driving around, I imagine this could have been slightly problematic for him if he was pulled over with his Canadian plates on. Another theory turns on questioning whether the hair loss medicine was just a cover story for a different purpose. It struck many as unlikely that a college student would drive deep into the United States just to buy a hair loss product. Arizona is a very long way from the Canadian border, and he could have been in Buffalo in upstate New York in about an hour's drive from Mississauga. And just to give some perspective on this isn't just a long drive, but a road trip of a lifetime, which would take approximately 32 hours if you were traveling in the most efficient way. And to be clear, the most efficient way to Arizona from Mississauga isn't through New York State, but rather through the border crossing at Detroit, adding another layer of strangeness. These factors have led to speculation that Stephen might have had an ulterior motive for his journey. It's conceivable he had arranged to meet someone, perhaps someone he met online in a chat room, given the late 1990s timing, and didn't want to tell his family the real reason for his trip. At this point, people were meeting online through chat rooms, though this was still a highly stigmatized way to meet people at that point. If Stephen was secretly headed to meet a person, some speculate that he may have been set up. Notably, his vehicle was seen crossing the border into the United States on Valentine's Day, which adds a layer of circumstantial credibility to this theory. This theory, however, is purely speculative, and given that it was 1998, it looks as though the police never even investigated what was on his computer. Another theory which Stephen's family has promoted throughout the years is that he may not have left Canada at all. That said, there's been no evidence whatsoever to suggest that he met his end anywhere in Canada either. Further, if there was foul play in Canada, I question why the criminal would take the risk of moving the car into the States. Border security was very loose before 2001, but that doesn't mean it wasn't there at all. And a border crossing is a massive added risk for a criminal. This is a case where all theories have good evidence in their favor, but where no theory fits all the facts neatly, and crucial pieces of evidence remain missing. That said, I do think this case has a good chance of being solved one day. There are tens of thousands of John Does out there waiting to be identified by the genetic genealogy revolution, and Stephen could be identified any day now. The liar paradox is a classic logical puzzle that arises from a sentence that refers to its own truth in a contradictory way. The simplest example is the sentence, "This sentence is false." At first glance, it seems innocuous, but trying to decide whether this sentence is true or false leads to a problem. If the sentence, quote, "This sentence is false," is true, then what it says must hold, meaning the sentence is false, which is a contradiction. On the other hand, if the sentence is false, then it is not the case that the sentence is false, meaning the sentence would actually be true, another contradiction. In either case, the statement cannot consistently be labeled true or false. It in effect says, "I am false," creating a loop in which truth and falsehood flip endlessly. Thus, the liar paradox leaves us with a statement that seems to be neither true nor false under the usual rules of logic. This simple, self-referential conundrum has puzzled thinkers for over 2 millennia, and experts have never reached a consensus on a definitive solution. The paradox is more than a linguistic joke. It exposes fundamental questions about truth and consistency in language and logic. The liar paradox has a long history. It's sometimes also called the Epimenides paradox, after a story from around the 6th century BC. Epimenides of Crete, an early philosopher, is reputed to have declared that all Cretans are liars always. Since Epimenides himself was a Cretan, his statement indirectly refers to itself. If all Cretans always lie, then his statement would be a lie, implying not all Cretans lie always, which in turn could make his statement true after all. A more direct formulation was given by the Greek philosopher Eubulides of Miletus in the 4th century BC. Eubulides, a contemporary of Aristotle, proposed a thought experiment where a man says he is lying. Eubulides then asks if the man's statement is true or false. This is essentially the liar paradox in plain language. If the man's statement is true, then he is telling the truth about lying, meaning he is actually lying, which contradicts the initial assumption of truth. If instead his statement is false, then the man is lying as he says, which means his claim, "I am lying," is true. Again, a contradiction. From early on, the liar paradox challenged basic logical principles. Aristotle formulated the law of non-contradiction, which says that no statement can be both true and false at the same time, creating a bedrock principle of rational thought. Yet the liar paradox seems to violate this law by forcing itself to be true if it's false and false if it's true. The Greek philosophers who discussed the liar paradox didn't conclude that language itself was broken. Rather, they found that something in our reasoning about such self-referential statements was leading to inconsistency. In the 20th century, the liar paradox became a central topic in logic and the philosophy of language, spurring the development of formal theories of truth. A breakthrough came from Polish logician Alfred Tarski, who analyzed the liar paradox while working on a formal definition of truth. Tarski showed in 1936 that any logical language powerful enough cannot consistently contain a truth predicate that refers to its own sentences. And as a quick aside, a truth predicate is a function that, when you plug in a statement, gives you a true or false output based on the rules of the logical system. In other words, you cannot have a single language in which you can freely say, "This sentence is true," or "This sentence is false," about sentences of that very language. His proposal was to avoid paradox by introducing a hierarchy of languages, a base object language in which statements are made, and a separate meta-language at a higher level. For example, a sentence in the meta-language can declare a sentence in the object language to be true or false, but no sentence is allowed to assert its own truth or falsity. This strategy avoids self-reference of the problematic kind. Tarski's insight, known as Tarski's undefinability theorem, essentially states that a consistent system cannot contain a mechanism to declare its own statements true or false globally. That said, while some have accepted that this solves the liar's paradox, others have proposed that it simply sidesteps the problem. After all, to truly end this problem, you would have to get into an endless recursion of meta-languages, which creates another host of problems all by itself. Anyway, despite the apparent simple nature of the liar paradox, it's become a cornerstone of logical reasoning, with no universally accepted solution. In the summer of 1993, 43-year-old Michael Hare vanished under puzzling circumstances from Bonner County, Idaho. On June 19, 1993, Hare had a heated argument with his wife at their home. In the midst of the dispute, he stormed out of the house in anger and never returned. When Hare failed to come back or contact anyone, his family grew concerned and reported him missing. Local law enforcement with the Bonner County Sheriff's Office treated the incident as a missing person case and began investigating, searching for any signs of Hare's whereabouts. Initially, there was little to go on. Hare had simply disappeared without a trace. In the immediate aftermath, deputies and detectives followed standard procedures. They interviewed Hare's wife and relatives, checked the areas he was known to frequent, and looked for any signs of an accident or voluntary departure. As weeks turned into months with no word from Hare, investigators began to suspect that more was at play than an angry husband cooling off. The fact that Hare had never been heard from again signaled that his disappearance was likely not voluntary. About a year after Hare went missing, a significant lead emerged. An informant came forward in 1994 with a startling story. According to this source, Michael Hare had not simply wandered off, but had been shot and then disposed of in a kiln. The reason given by the informant was that Hare allegedly knew about a secret grow-op and was slain to keep him silent. They looked for anyone in Hare's circle who might be involved in illegal substance activity and landed upon Jim Montz, Hare's stepson. Investigators learned that Montz had a history with substances, and they suspected he might be running a street cabbage farming operation. In September 1994, acting on the informant's tip, Bonner County deputies and Idaho State Police officers executed a search warrant on Montz's rural property. What they uncovered was indeed a sophisticated enterprise. Montz had an underground bunker concealing roughly 80 plants, complete with high-end cultivation equipment. The discovery confirmed a major part of the informant's story. During the raid, officers also noticed something else that sent a jolt through the investigative team. A large kiln was discovered on the property, just like the informant said it would be. This was exactly the type of oven the informant had described as being used to cremate Hare's body. The presence of the kiln gave investigators both a possible crime scene and physical evidence to scrutinize. Montz was arrested at the scene on substance manufacturing charges. With Montz in custody, law enforcement turned their attention to gathering physical evidence that could confirm what happened to Michael Hare. The kiln found on Montz's property became the focus of a painstaking forensic search. Investigators sifted through the ashes and debris inside the kiln, looking for any trace of human remains that might have survived high-temperature burning. Indeed, they did find some bones amid the ashes, raising hopes of a breakthrough. However, after examination, the sheriff reported that the bones recovered were actually from animals. Undeterred, detectives collected ash samples and other material from the kiln and surrounding area for advanced testing. These samples were sent to laboratories for analysis to detect microscopic traces of human tissue. Once again, no definitive human remains were recovered from the kiln. Montz ultimately pleaded guilty to the substance manufacturing charges, which carried a potential 5-year prison sentence. Montz's sentencing was scheduled for June 12, 1995. Given Montz's status as the prime suspect in the Hare investigation, prosecutors argued he was a flight risk and even pushed for a $250,000 bail. However, the court allowed Montz a much lower bail of $20,000 and permitted him to remain free until sentencing under certain conditions. These were pretty standard. He had to surrender his passport, reside in the area, and check in with authorities daily. These precautions unfortunately proved insufficient, and on June 12, 1995, Montz never showed up for his sentencing hearing. For nearly 30 years, Jim Montz lived life on the lam, successfully evading capture. That changed in early 2025, when cold case detectives finally got the break they needed. While working the unsolved disappearance, Bonner County investigators and the Idaho State Police learned that Montz had been living under an assumed name in Georgia. Acting on this information, the U.S. Marshals Service, together with local authorities in Georgia, moved in and arrested Montz at a home in Thomasville. Investigators have questioned why he fled from what was ultimately to be a fairly short prison sentence, unless he suspected he was about to be charged with Hare's death. I hope to have an update on the disappearance of Michael Hare in a future episode. All that said, the authorities haven't yet charged Montz in relation to Hare's disappearance yet. Further, given that the informant gave his evidence over 30 years ago, I question what evidentiary issues the authorities will face in bringing charges at this point. Lisa Jane Borden was last seen by her family on October 10, 1979, in her hometown of Big Spring, Texas. Shortly afterward, the 19-year-old headed west to California on a solo hitchhiking trip. Notably, this wasn't uncommon or unusual at the time, and her family wasn't concerned. Later that month, Lisa phoned her relatives from Lodi, California, which would be the final contact anyone had with her. And just a quick note here, because I know many of you are probably thinking the same thing I thought. What was she even doing in California? Well, unfortunately, details on this case are quite sparse, and it isn't clear from publicly available information exactly what she was doing there. She had planned to return to Texas. Her boyfriend purchased a plane ticket for her trip home, to be picked up at the airport, but Lisa never arrived to claim it. After that last phone call, all communication from her ceased. She was officially reported missing by her sister when Lisa failed to come home and could not be located. The Big Spring Police Department in Texas took the lead in the case, in coordination with California authorities, given that was Lisa's last known location. Early on, information was scarce. One of Lisa's friends claimed that sometime after October 1979, Lisa was allegedly spotted in Amarillo, Texas, working as a waitress. This tip gave a glimmer of hope that perhaps Lisa was still alive and had chosen to stay away on her own. However, the friend provided no evidence or details to back up the story, and investigators were unable to confirm that Lisa was ever in Amarillo. Aside from that unverified account, no credible sightings or messages from Lisa ever surfaced after her disappearance. Despite the passage of time, there have been no breakthroughs in her case, and her case has gotten very little in the way of attention. What happened to Lisa remains completely unknown at present, with all theories being pure conjecture based on the extremely limited evidence. That said, given that she was in California during the 1970s, much of the online discussion on her case has focused on the potential that she fell victim to a serial predator. However, it's unclear if the authorities have ever seriously pursued this line of investigation. The story of the Pied Piper of Hamelin is among the most enduring and enigmatic legends of medieval Europe. It's said that in 1284, a mysterious stranger arrived in Hamelin, Germany, and used his magic pipe to first rid the town of rats. When the townspeople refused to pay him for his services, he then lured away the children from the town. While this legend has been told in stories and fairy tales, it also has a grounding in historical records that reference the sudden disappearance of Hamelin's children. Historically, the earliest known written reference to this event in Hamelin appears on a church window dating back to around 1300. This window reportedly depicted a piper leading a group of children out of the town. Unfortunately, this window was destroyed in 1660, and what we know of it comes only from older accounts. Other evidence includes a 14th century entry in the town's chronicles that reads, "It is 100 years since our children left," as well as references in various medieval manuscripts. Though these sources are fragmentary, they indicate that something significant indeed happened to Hamelin's children. The question that still dogs historians is simple: what actually took place? One popular theory, and arguably the one most tied to the fairy tale element, involves literal rat infestation. In the commonly told version of the story, rats invaded the town, causing destruction, disease, and panic. A colorfully dressed piper arrived, offered to get rid of the pests for a modest sum, and successfully led the rats to drown in a local river by playing his flute. When the townspeople refused to pay him, he sought revenge by doing the same with their children, leading them away, never to return. However, some historians point out that the earliest versions of the tale don't even mention rats, suggesting that the rat infestation may have been a later embellishment. This first mention of rats wasn't added in surviving texts until the 16th century, 3 centuries after the purported event. Now, of course, here I have to mention that this could just be survivorship bias in the source material. There may well have been earlier texts that mention the rats, but these texts may now be lost. It's also possible that the rat element was added to dramatize the story or give a moral lesson on keeping one's promises. After all, without the rat element, the lesson of keeping your word to those who assist you is completely lost, and instead it becomes a narrative about not trusting strangers or outsiders. Another explanation theorizes that the children's disappearance could have been tied to disease, particularly the plague. In the Middle Ages, outbreaks of plague were frequent, claiming countless lives and often displacing communities. Some historians argue that the children the piper took away might refer metaphorically to those who died, or those who fled Hamelin during an epidemic. In this theory, the Pied Piper is a symbolic figure representing death. While compelling, this interpretation doesn't perfectly account for the specificity of the date, 1284, or the details about a single event that removed only the town's children. A separate theory suggests that the children left Hamelin in a mass migration, or children's crusade. Historians note that during the Middle Ages, there were instances of large groups leaving their hometowns en masse in search of better opportunities or in response to religious fervor. The Pied Piper, in this interpretation, could be a recruiter or locator from Eastern Europe, beckoning laborers or colonists. Indeed, parts of Eastern Europe were being resettled en masse by Germans at that time, a process known as Ostsiedlung. If this were the case, the piper might have been a charismatic figure who convinced young people to start new lives elsewhere. Over time, the legend may have turned him into a mystical figure who spirited them away. Yet another perspective links the disappearance of the children to a possible military campaign. During the period in question, territorial conflicts were common, and mercenaries sometimes passed through towns promising wealth or glory to eager youths. Some scholars suggest that children could refer not only to those who were minors, but to younger adults who chose to follow a recruiter onto a battlefield or into another region. Under this theory, they may have been involved in a mass casualty event on a battlefield somewhere, leading to an entire generation of Hamelin youth being wiped out. And to put things in perspective, the town only had about 2,500 inhabitants around the year 1700. Though we don't have data for Hamelin's population in the 13th century, it may have been substantially less. Under this theory, then, a generation of youth could be as little as a few dozen boys going off to war and being eliminated or simply never returning. The Brothers Grimm helped immortalize the Pied Piper story in their collection of German legends, first published in the early 19th century. Their retelling solidified many of the details that we associate with it today: the bright clothing, the magic pipe, and the tragic betrayal by the townspeople. While their rendition is by no means a faithful historical record, it did capture the essence of local lore and passed it on to wider audiences. On January 26, 1966, the 3 Beaumont siblings, Jane, age 9, Arna, 7, and Grant, 4, left their family home in Somerton Park, Adelaide, for a morning at Glenelg Beach. It was a routine outing they had done before, without parental supervision. The children took a short bus ride to the popular beach, planning to be back by midday. Their parents assumed they would be safe and sound, having a fun day at the beach. Sadly, This couldn't be further from the truth. At the beach, multiple witnesses later reported seeing the Beaumont children in the company of an unknown man. One woman described this man as being in his late 30s, around 6 feet tall with a slim build, a thin face, light-colored hair, and a deep tan. He was reportedly wearing swim trunks and playing with the children, who appeared relaxed and happy in his presence. When the children failed to return home at the expected time, their mother, Nancy Beaumont, grew worried. By the evening, after their father, Jim Beaumont, returned, and a search of the neighborhood turned up nothing, the police were notified. An intensive search began that night and continued into the next day. By the morning of January 27th, the 3 Beaumont children were officially declared missing by police, and a large-scale investigation was underway. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. The disappearance of 3 children in broad daylight from a busy beach shocked Australia. Hundreds of locals volunteered to help search the area, and media coverage spread nationwide as concern grew. Initially, some speculated the children might have simply wandered off or had a misadventure, for example, getting lost or drowning. But there were no clues to support those theories. Their belongings were found neatly left on the beach, and witnesses clearly remembered seeing them with an unknown man, pointing to an abduction scenario rather than an accident. The investigation into the Beaumont children's disappearance quickly became one of the largest in Australian history. Within a few days, authorities had dismissed the possibility of an accidental drowning or other mishap. There was simply no evidence of the children anywhere, leading police to conclude that abduction and likely foul play was the cause. A notable early effort was the draining of the Padawalonga Boat Haven, a nearby holding basin of water, on January 29, 1966. This drastic measure was taken after a woman reported having spoken with 3 children, matching the Beaumont siblings' description near the haven on the evening they disappeared. Unfortunately, the search of the drained basin yielded no clues, and no trace of the children was found there or in the surrounding areas. Leads poured in as the public flooded police with reports of potential sightings and information. Some witnesses from the beach that day recalled the children saying they were going to buy food. Indeed, investigators later learned that Jane Beaumont had purchased pastries with a $1 note, a bill her parents hadn't given her. This clue eerily suggested the unknown man had given them money, likely in an effort to earn their trust. Despite many tips, no definitive identification of the suspect was made in the initial investigation. A sketch of the blonde, athletically built man seen with them was circulated, but it led to no firm arrests. As weeks turned into months, the case went cold, but it never left the public consciousness. In 1968, about 2 years after the disappearance, the Beaumont parents received a series of letters that briefly raised hopes. One letter, purportedly written by 9-year-old Jane, claimed that the trio was safe and being cared for by a man. Another letter, allegedly from the abductor, arranged a meeting for the parents to recover their children. The Beaumonts, accompanied by an undercover detective, went to the appointed meeting place only for no one to show up. It was later revealed that these letters were a cruel hoax. Decades later, police traced them to a man who had been a teenager in 1966 and had written the letters, quote, as a joke. He was identified as a 41-year-old man in 1992 and confessed to the hoax, though he was never charged for it. Over the years, the Beaumont investigation had periodic resurgences with new leads and theories. In the late 1970s and 1980s, police re-examined files to see if the Beaumont case could be connected to other child disappearances. Notably, the disappearance of Joanne Ratcliffe, aged 11, and Kirsty Gordon, 4, from a soccer match at Adelaide Oval in 1973, was scrutinized for links. The circumstances, children taken in daylight from a public place, were eerily similar, and some investigators believed the same perpetrator could be responsible for both crimes. Also, when I was researching this case, this was the first I had heard of the Adelaide Oval case. I actually went off on a tangent and did a write-up for that case, which I'll be featuring in an upcoming episode. Despite these theories, concrete evidence remained elusive. In 2013, on the eve of the 50th anniversary of the case, South Australia police and independent investigators pursued a new tip leading to a dig at a factory site not far from the beach. This new lead suggested the children might have been buried there. The tip came from two men who reported that as boys, around the time of the Beaumont disappearance, they were paid by a local businessman to dig a large hole on that factory property. This businessman would later emerge as a major person of interest, but I'll come back to that shortly. However, after searching the area thoroughly, over the course of a number of years, no evidence turned up. The authorities used everything in their power, including physical digs, and as the technology has advanced, ground-penetrating radar has been used extensively to no avail. That said, the factory site hasn't been officially ruled out, and as you'll see shortly, there's significant circumstantial evidence to corroborate the two men's story. Over the many years of investigation, police have explored numerous suspects and persons of interest. While no one has ever been charged in the Beaumont case, a few individuals have emerged as particularly credible or notorious suspects. Bevan Spencer von Einem, born in 1946, is a convicted likely serial slayer from Adelaide. He was sentenced to life imprisonment in 1984 for the slaying of a 15-year-old boy, Richard Kelvin. In the 1980s, an informant known only as Mr. B told police an astonishing story. He claimed that von Einem had boasted about having taken 3 children from a beach years earlier. Personally, I had to tap out of reading this informant's account of what happened, and I would strongly suggest you don't go further down that rabbit hole. However, there's significant skepticism about von Einem's involvement, given that he was only 20 years old at the time the Beaumont children disappeared. Further, the victims didn't fit his target profile, and he denied any involvement in the crimes, though there's absolutely no reason to take the word of someone like this at face value. Another suspect is Arthur Stanley Brown, who became a target in the Beaumont case more than 30 years after the children vanished. Brown committed an extremely horrific act against 2 sisters, Judith and Susan McKay, in Queensland in August 1970. This crime occurred 4 years after the Beaumont disappearance and in a different state, but Brown's alleged crimes and profile drew comparisons. Investigators noted that Brown bore a resemblance to the composite sketch of the Beaumont suspect. However, despite these similarities, nothing further has come from this investigative hypothesis. The authorities have released significant information on who they consider to be the most likely perpetrator in the case. Harry Phipps was a wealthy businessman from Adelaide who has come under scrutiny as a potentially key suspect in the Beaumont case. Phipps, who died in 2004, was never officially charged in connection with the disappearance, but several pieces of information that emerged years later have cast him in a suspicious light. Phipps lived near Glenelg Beach in 1966 and was known to be in the area at the time. Notably, his eldest son, Hayden, came forward with disturbing allegations. Hayden claimed that his father was a violent cheddar pile, and strongly suggested that Harry Phipps could have been involved in the abduction of the Beaumont children. Hayden recounted that he saw the Beaumont children at his father's house that day, a claim that, while unverified, brought intense attention to Phipps as a suspect. Further, as discussed earlier, 2 boys were hired by Harry Phipps to dig a large hole shortly after the Beaumont children vanished. All these factors put together have led investigators to believe that he is likely the prime suspect in their disappearance. I do have to question why the 2 who were hired by Phipps as well as his son Hayden, took over 50 years to bring forward their evidence. That said, there's potentially an explanation for this. Notably, they only came forward after Phipps was deceased, indicating that the three may have been terrified of the man well into their adulthood. Despite the array of suspects and theories, authorities have never been able to bring formal charges against anyone for the abduction of the Beaumont children. The case remains officially unsolved, with each suspect ultimately providing more questions than answers. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with a reminder to hit that notification bell and share this video with 2 people you know. With my channel growing as fast as it is lately, I've set a goal to produce a video every day, so hitting that notification bell ensures you never miss my regular drops. Also, big thanks to new Patreon supporter Will Surrett. The Eastbound Strangler refers to an unidentified serial offender believed to have slain 4 women near Atlantic City, New Jersey in late 2006. The case gets its name from the fact that each victim was found with her head facing east, towards Atlantic City. On November 20th, 2006, 2 women walking near a desolate stretch outside Atlantic City made a grim discovery. They stumbled upon the body of 35-year-old Kim Raffo, lying face down in a drainage ditch behind the Golden Key Motel in West Atlantic City. The area around this shallow runoff ditch was a known hangout in a seedy area on the outskirts of the city. When police arrived at the scene, they quickly found 3 more bodies in the same ditch, all within about 50 yards of Raffo's remains. The 4 victims were found fully clothed, except for their shoes and socks, and lying face down in a row, all with their heads oddly turned toward the east. The victims were eventually identified as 4 women who had been involved in paid companionship work in the Atlantic City area. Each had fallen on hard times before their deaths, and all were mothers struggling with personal issues. Barbara Brador, 42, was last seen in October 2006. She was known to have battled multiple substance addictions. By the time her body was found, it was badly decomposed, and investigators could not determine an exact cause of death. Molly Jean Diltz was 20 years old, and originally from Pennsylvania. Diltz was fairly new to Atlantic City. She was the only victim without a known record of SW, though police believe she had recently entered that life. She is thought to have been the first slain, and her remains were so decomposed that her cause of death could not be determined. Kim Raffo, 35, was a former waitress from Brooklyn, New York. Raffo had moved to Atlantic City in 2003 and struggled with substance addiction. She was seen alive just 1 day before the bodies were discovered. Raffo is strongly believed to have been the last of the 4 victims to die, and unlike the others, her cause of death was clear. She had been strangled with a rope or cord. Tracy Ann Roberts, 23, was a former dancer from Delaware who had only moved to Atlantic City within the past year. In the weeks before her death, she survived an assault by a man who tried to get her to work for him in an illicit capacity. It's unclear whether there's any connection between this event and her subsequent slaying, though the authorities generally don't believe so. Her body showed signs of asphyxiation, indicating she was likely strangled by the perpetrator. All 4 women were found barefoot, with their feet pointing up against the bank of the ditch. Investigators believe the man removed their shoes and used the position of their feet to anchor the bodies in place so they wouldn't wash away in the water. The eerie arrangement of the victims immediately signaled to police that this was a serial crime scene rather than a dumping ground used by multiple perps. The discovery of 4 slain women just outside a major tourist destination sent shockwaves through the community. In the immediate aftermath, the case commanded intense attention. Over 100 detectives, local and state, were assigned to work on the investigation, and national media descended on Atlantic City. Authorities quickly confirmed that the 4 acts almost certainly met the FBI's definition of a serial offender case. Several persons of interest did emerge in the investigation, though none have been charged, nor have any been definitively linked to the case. One of the first was Terry Olson, a 41-year-old handyman from southern New Jersey. Olson was living at the rundown Golden Key Motel, near where the bodies were found. At the time of the slayings, he was staying in a room free of charge in exchange for doing odd jobs and maintenance work around the property. Shortly after news broke, Olson's girlfriend, with whom he was having a bad breakup, called police and pointed to him as a possible perpetrator. Detectives brought Olson in for hours of intense questioning. A search of his living space turned up tapes that contained disturbing hidden footage of his girlfriend's teenage daughter, for which he was ultimately charged. This discovery made Olson look more suspicious, but crucially, when he provided DNA samples, none of his DNA matched any evidence from the victims. Investigators never found anything directly tying him to the slayings, and Olson was eventually released and is no longer considered a suspect. Another name that surfaced was Eldred Raymond Burchell, a transient man who had nicknamed himself the River Man, in reference to the infamous Gary Ridgway. A local worker, Denise Hill, told police that Burchell spent time with her around 2006 and allegedly confessed to having slain women. Burchell was indeed in Atlantic City during the period the acts took place, but when police attempted to locate him for questioning, he had vanished. His whereabouts remain unknown, and authorities found no hard evidence linking him to the 4 victims aside from the second-hand claim. Like Olson, Burchell has never been formally charged in connection with the case, and has never officially been named a suspect. Investigators also interviewed at least 2 other local men who knew one or more of the victims, but they too were released without charge. To date, no current suspect has been publicly named, and no arrests have ever been made in the Eastbound Strangler case. Over time, several theories have emerged about the identity and motive of the Eastbound Strangler. One of the most widely discussed ideas was a possible connection to the notorious Long Island serial slayer case. The case involved a series of slayings of workers whose remains were found on Gilgo Beach in Long Island from 2010 onwards. Theorists noted the similarities. Multiple female victims, all involved in the same type of work, with their bodies dumped in a coastal area. In late 2010, New Jersey and New York authorities did investigate a possible link between the 2 cases. However, they found no evidence to tie the crimes together and ultimately ruled out any connection at that time. The theory resurfaced in 2023 when a suspect was arrested in the Long Island case. Once again, officials compared details and affirmed that there was no link between the 2 cases. Given that DNA evidence is available in both cases, I have to assume that the DNA evidence simply didn't add up. Another persistent question is why the acts stopped after that cluster of 4 in fall 2006. Serial perps typically continue until caught, so the sudden halt in known victims has led to a number of theories. Some believe the perpetrator may have left the area, been incarcerated for another crime, or even died, which could explain the absence of further incidents. Others have speculated if the eastward positioning of the bodies was symbolic. Certain types of serial slayers believe they are on some sort of mission, generally to rid the world of what they view as quote-unquote corruption. The pointing of the victims toward the neon glow of the casinos has been suggested to cast blame on Atlantic City's vice-based industries. Others have speculated that it had some sort of ritual or occult significance, since they were all pointed towards the sunrise in what could be argued to be a ritualistic manner. These ideas, of course, remain entirely conjecture, without hard proof or even circumstantial evidence. Wendy Abrams Nishikai was a 21-year-old University of California, Berkeley student when she vanished on Halloween night in 1989. For months, authorities searched for Wendy, but no trace of her was found in the immediate aftermath of her disappearance. In February 1990, a grim discovery finally provided a clue. Two local hunters exploring a remote area in Colfax, a small town in Placer County, California, noticed clothing and shoes at the bottom of a steep embankment. This led authorities to human remains later confirmed to be a young woman. The location was over 100 miles from Wendy's home in Berkeley, deep in the Sierra Nevada foothills, indicating that she had somehow ended up far from where she was last seen. Investigators at the time could not identify the body, as forensic technology was limited. They classified the unknown woman as Jane Doe, despite extensive efforts such as examining dental records. With no leads on the victim's identity or the circumstances of her death, the case grew cold as the years passed. In 2023, Placer County authorities formed a cold case investigations unit and reopened the Jane Doe case, applying new genetic genealogy techniques to identify the long unidentified victim. In January 2025, DNA comparisons with family members confirmed that the remains belonged to Wendy, officially solving the 35-year-old mystery of the Jane Doe's identity. With Wendy's identity confirmed, the case has shifted fully into a slaying investigation. The exact circumstances of her death remain unclear, and authorities have not publicly disclosed details about how she died or who might be a suspect. However, officials have made one thing clear: they believe Wendy was the victim of foul play. Now that Wendy has had her identity restored, I'm hopeful that the authorities will be able to make a breakthrough in the investigation. I'm hoping that I'll have an update on this case in the coming months and years. Zoe McClellan, an American actress known for her roles on JAG and NCIS New Orleans, has been at the center of a disturbing disappearance. McClellan and her young son, Sebastian, vanished in 2021 amid a protracted custody battle with her ex-husband, actor J.P. Gillane. McClellan's personal troubles began after her 2016 divorce. In 2017, their custody dispute escalated when McClellan moved to Toronto for a filming job and brought then 4-year-old Sebastian with her. Gillane accused her of violating their custody agreement by taking the child out of state without sufficient notice. He even filed child abduction charges against McClellan at the time. However, a court ultimately ruled in McClellan's favor in that dispute. A judge determined that McClellan's move was work-related and not an abduction, noting it was known to both parents that her acting career might require travel. In fact, McClellan was deemed the primary parent, and she had support from NCIS colleagues who provided testimonials on her behalf. This early legal victory for McClellan set the stage for an increasingly bitter custody saga. On April 16, 2019, Zoe McClellan and her son effectively disappeared from public view for the first time. According to Gillane, he had not seen or heard from McClellan or their child since April 2019, when she allegedly fled with the boy. Gillane reported the situation to the authorities, characterizing McClellan's actions as a parental kidnapping. Initially, the matter was treated as a custody violation, but as time passed with no contact, it became a missing persons case for the child. The Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office eventually got involved, and Sebastian was registered with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children as an abducted child. McClellan was named as the abductor in official bulletins, which noted that mother and son went missing from Los Angeles and might have traveled elsewhere. At this stage, the priority for law enforcement was to locate the child and ensure his safety. McClellan eventually resurfaced with Sebastian, but things were about to go even further off the rails. In a dramatic turn of events, J.P. Gillane himself became the subject of a criminal investigation in late 2019, which affected the trajectory of the case. McClellan had long claimed that her ex-husband was dangerous to their son, and those allegations appeared to gain credibility when Gillane was arrested in January 2020. However, Ghislaine's legal ordeal was short-lived. After spending a few months in jail, Ghislaine was released in mid-2020 when prosecutors dropped the charges due to insufficient evidence. The resolution of the criminal case against Ghislaine shifted the focus back to Zoe McClellan. In September 2020, a California family court awarded sole custody of Sebastian to Ghislaine and ordered McClellan to surrender the child to his father. McClellan, however, never complied. She had stopped participating in court hearings by late 2020, and her attorneys didn't respond to court filings. In April 2021, a judge directed the LA County District Attorney's Child Abduction Unit to use all necessary means to find McClellan and her son. Shortly thereafter, on May 14, 2021, a felony arrest warrant was formally issued for Zoe McClellan on charges of kidnapping. With a warrant in place, law enforcement efforts intensified. Los Angeles authorities coordinated with other jurisdictions where McClellan had ties, including Louisiana, and alerts were disseminated nationwide. McClellan and her son were entered into national missing persons databases. In July 2021, a California judge scheduled a hearing and ordered McClellan to appear on July 15, 2021, and hand over Sebastian to his father. McClellan failed to show up in court, as many expected, given that her whereabouts were still unknown. By mid-2021, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department confirmed it had no leads on McClellan's location. As authorities and private investigators pursued the case, theories about McClellan's whereabouts have emerged. Because she has ties to both California and Louisiana, those areas have been focal points. Early in the search, sources speculated that McClellan stayed in Louisiana, possibly living off the grid to avoid detection. In fact, Los Angeles investigators initially got hints in 2021 that she might be hiding somewhere near New Orleans. McClellan had lived in the region during NCIS and still had friends or contacts there, which could provide a support network for laying low. And it's important to remember that McClellan's official story is that her ex-husband is a very dangerous person. It's possible that the person or people harboring her and her son believe they're actually saving Sebastian from a horrific fate. On the other hand, there is the possibility that she left the United States entirely. Some reports suggested McClellan might have fled across the border to Canada, given her previous residence in Toronto and the fact that she had worked there before. Others have speculated that given her drastic and disturbing actions thus far, Zoe and her son may no longer be among the living. And just as a quick aside, I'm somewhat surprised this case hasn't gotten way more attention, given the involvement of a decently well-known celebrity. In July 1990, the headless and handless body of 34-year-old Beverly Ann McGowan was discovered on a remote canal bank in southern Florida. Her gruesome fate shocked investigators and the public, not only for its brutality, but for the audacious con artist behind it. In early July 1990, Beverly McGowan placed a classified ad in the Sun Sentinel newspaper seeking a female roommate for her two-bedroom condo. A well-dressed British woman calling herself Alice responded, claiming to be an IBM employee transferred to Fort Lauderdale. Beverly's friends and family recall how quickly Alice charmed her. She spoke with a refined English accent and introduced Beverly to the idea of numerology, which in this case involved using personal numbers to predict one's future. Beverly, eager to bond with her new roommate, provided Alice with personal details like her social security, driver's license, and bank account numbers, supposedly for a numerology chart. And yeah, I can already predict the comments flooding in on this aspect of the case, but I digress. Just days after Alice moved in, Beverly suddenly vanished around July 17, 1990. This abrupt disappearance alarmed her siblings. They visited her condo to find the home in disarray. Beverly's car was missing, her bed unmade with her nightgown laid out, and the phone disconnected. Oddly, her two beloved cats were gone, and personal documents such as her address book, birth certificate, and passport had also disappeared. On July 19th, friends and family received handwritten letters claiming to be from Beverly, claiming she had sold her condo and was starting a new life elsewhere. The tone sounded casual, and the handwriting initially appeared to be hers, which confused investigators because there were no obvious signs she had been forced to write the notes. That same day, however, a fisherman made a grim discovery about 100 miles away: the body of a woman dumped in a canal in St. Lucie County, Florida. The victim's head and hands had been cut off, and a tattoo on her abdomen had been removed, evidently to impede identification. Despite the perpetrator's effort to mask the victim's identity, they overlooked a small flower tattoo on the woman's ankle. Further, the removal of her head had been incomplete to the point that some dental evidence could be collected. Using the tattoo and dental records, police identified the body as Beverly McGowan. Once Beverly's remains were identified, the mysterious roommate Alice became the prime suspect. Detectives quickly surmised that the farewell letters were part of an elaborate deception to delay alarm while the perpetrator fled. Investigators began retracing Beverly's steps and soon uncovered critical evidence that pointed to identity theft and fraud. They learned that someone had been using Beverly's credit cards in the days following her slaying. In fact, a woman matching Alice's description was seen on surveillance using one of McGowan's cards to purchase items and withdraw cash. Police also found Beverly's car abandoned at Miami International Airport. Inside the car, they discovered strands of hair from a wig, suggesting a disguise. This clue proved significant when authorities learned that a person impersonating Beverly had reserved a rental car at London's Heathrow Airport around the same time. According to witnesses, a person described as a man in a woman's wig picked up the rental car using Beverly's name and identification. By now, it was clear the perpetrator had stolen Beverly's identity and left the country. Detectives checked flight manifests out of Miami and discovered that Alice had flown to England on a British Airways flight under the name Sylvia Ann Hodgkinson. This name was familiar to law enforcement, and further investigation revealed it likely belonged to an Englishwoman Alice had befriended in the past. The real Sylvia Hodgkinson has never been found, and authorities suspected she might have been an earlier victim of the same perpetrator. Through this alias, police finally uncovered Alice's apparent true identity: Elaine Parent, an apparently American con artist with a lengthy history of fraud and assumed names. Identifying Elaine Parent was a major breakthrough, but catching her proved to be an enormous challenge. Parent had already fled overseas, and she was a master at vanishing into new personas. In May 1991, Interpol agents actually apprehended Parent in London for carrying a fake passport, where she was found with identification in the names of Hodgkinson and another woman. Astonishingly, due to insufficient evidence tying her to the Florida case at that time, she was released before authorities realized who they truly had in custody. By the time Florida investigators linked forensic evidence from Beverly's car and handwriting in the condo to Parent, their suspect had slipped away again. Elaine Parent then spent the next several years hopscotching around the globe. Reports of sightings came in from all over, ranging from London, Paris, Istanbul, to parts of Australia and South Africa, but each time she managed to stay a step ahead of the law. The case grew cold, but it was never closed. In 1998, in a bizarre twist, the fugitive herself sent police a taunting message. Detectives in Florida received a package containing a photograph of an oil painting, a self-portrait of Elaine Parent. On the back, a note was typed: "Best wishes, your chameleon. referencing her chameleon-like ability to change identities. Also, unfortunately, it looks as though this oil painting has never been released to the public, as I was unable to find a copy of it anywhere online. The breakthrough finally came in April 2002, nearly 12 years after Beverly's slaying. Acting on a fresh tip, police tracked Elaine Parent to an apartment in Panama City, Florida. After evading capture for so long, Parent's luck had run out and law enforcement surrounded her residence. Even in her final moments, the 59-year-old con artist remained dramatic and unyielding. As officers stood outside her bedroom door, giving her a moment to get dressed, Parent decided to take out the trash herself. Elaine Parent died on April 6, 2002, taking with her any secrets about her motives and possible other crimes. So you may be sitting here and asking yourself where the mystery is. Well, earlier on I mentioned that Elaine Parent was apparently her real name and that she was apparently American. Investigators believe that the Elaine Parent identity may have just been another in this criminal's inception-like layers of identities. No birth certificate or other evidence has ever been found to support the existence of Elaine Parent as a real person. No family members or friends have ever been located who knew this individual her whole life to verify her identity. Some investigators believe that her claim to be an American was false, and that she was actually a British or South African woman, pretending to be an American, pretending to be a Brit. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with a reminder to hit subscribe and share this video with 2 people you know. In June 1973, a young couple from Edmonton, Canada, 27-year-old Ron Yakimchuk and his 23-year-old wife Terry Pettit, set off on a cross-country road trip with high hopes for the future. They packed their belongings into a battered 1959 Volkswagen Beetle, so dilapidated it had mismatched red and green body panels, and strapped their mattress to the roof of the vehicle. Ron and Terry planned to attend a friend's wedding in Montreal scheduled for June 16th. After this, they planned on continuing east to Canada's maritime provinces, where Ron had a lead on a teaching job, and Terry, a journalist, hoped to find work at a newspaper. It was essentially a delayed honeymoon road adventure, as the free-spirited couple looked forward to starting a new life out east. Friends gathered to see them off from Edmonton on a cloudy Sunday morning, snapping a photo of the pair in their overloaded Beetle as they drove away. No one imagined it would be the last time they'd ever be seen. Both Ron and Terry were well known among their peers. Terry was a reporter at the Edmonton Journal, and Ron had been the editor of the Poundmaker, a student newspaper at the University of Alberta. They had met during their university days and shared a love of adventure and journalism. The couple had postponed their departure several times, but by early June they finally hit the road, excited and full of optimism. Friends later recalled how eager the two were for a change of scenery after years in Edmonton's media scene. Ron and Terry's journey initially seemed to go as planned. They made a brief detour to visit friends near Brandon, Manitoba, a stop along their eastward route. By June 12, 1973, the couple had reached Dryden, a town in northwestern Ontario. From Dryden, they mailed a postcard back to a friend in Edmonton. According to some sources, Terry had bet a friend that the rickety Volkswagen would survive the cross-Canada trek, while her friend said they'd never make it to Ontario. That Dryden postcard would become the last known contact from the couple. After Dryden, the trail grew cold. Ron and Terry never showed up at the Montreal area wedding they were expected to attend on June 16th. Concern began to spread among their friends and family immediately. However, when the couple failed to reach their destination in the Maritimes in due course, this concern became fear and then outright panic. In the days and weeks following, loved ones grew increasingly alarmed. The couple, who were known to be responsible and considerate, had effectively fallen off the face of the earth during what should have been a routine drive across Ontario. Early on, police were slow to act, reasoning that a pair of young adults on a road trip could be anywhere and might simply have decided to take a detour or delay. By the time an investigation belatedly kicked off, any clues along their route had long since evaporated. From the beginning, the evidence suggested that Ron and Terry didn't disappear by choice, though it appears some investigators figured they had just started a new life. Soon, however, investigators found that their bank accounts were never touched after June 1973. The cash they had in the accounts for the purposes of the trip remained unspent. These signs indicated the couple hadn't started a new life in secret. All their financial activity simply stopped. Over the decades, various theories have emerged to explain how an entire couple and their car could simply vanish. The most straightforward theory is that Ron and Terry suffered a crash in a remote area of northern Ontario. The Trans-Canada Highway in 1973 included long stretches of isolated, hilly roads around Lake Superior, with steep embankments and countless lakes and dense bush along the way. It's possible the overloaded Beetle swerved off the road, perhaps to avoid an animal or due to driver fatigue at night, and plunged into a thick forest or deep lake, hidden from view. If the vehicle plunged into a body of water along a desolate portion of the Trans-Canada Highway, there would be virtually no chance they would ever be recovered. Another possibility is that the couple fell victim to foul play during their journey. The couple may have picked up a hitchhiker or stopped to help someone, only to be met with violence. If they were attacked by a criminal, the perpetrator could have disposed of their bodies and hidden or destroyed the car, which might explain why it never turned up. This theory, while plausible, has no hard evidence behind it, as no known suspects or crime scenes have ever been linked to their disappearance. Further, given that we have photographic evidence of how packed their vehicle was, I'm not convinced they could have picked up a hitchhiker even if they wanted to. The picture we have is from Edmonton, but this was all the stuff they'd packed up to move to eastern Canada, so I can't imagine they had any more room in the Beetle at that point. Another theory involves a detour they may have taken. Given the challenging driving on the northern Trans-Canada route, Ron and Terry may have decided to take an alternate path. There was speculation that they detoured south across the U.S. border to find an easier road east. There are no records confirming the two crossed the border, and it's unknown if police ever found evidence of them in the States. This idea essentially overlaps with both the accident and foul play theories, merely shifting the location. Again, without any confirmed sightings or documentation from U.S. authorities, the cross-border detour remains an unverified guess. Personally, I think the idea that their vehicle went off the Trans-Canada Highway into a body of water is the most likely. If they were driving at night and the driver dozed off, they could have easily driven off the road and into a lake or deep river, never to be seen again. Another major problem with this case, and why it will likely never be solved, is that there's multiple possible routes between Dryden and Montreal. The shortest of these routes, along the Trans-Canada Highway, is approximately 1,200 miles, and most of this stretch is virtually uninhabited. Stendhal syndrome is a psychological condition that reportedly causes overwhelming physical and emotional responses when someone encounters particularly significant works of art. The condition is named after the 19th century French writer Stendhal, who documented such an experience in 1817. Stendhal recounted an intense episode of dizziness, rapid heartbeat, and near collapse while visiting the Basilica of Santa Croce in Florence. In his book, Naples and Florence, A Journey from Milan to Reggio, he described being overwhelmed by the beauty and historical significance of the art and architecture. To quote the man himself, he wrote, "I was in a sort of ecstasy from the idea of being in Florence, close to the great men whose tombs I had seen." This is generally cited as the first written record of such an experience, though it's generally thought that he was just the first to write it down. Stendhal syndrome manifests as a range of physical and psychological symptoms. People have reported feeling disoriented, anxious, or even euphoric. Physical symptoms like sweating, rapid heartbeat, and fainting are common. In severe cases, individuals have experienced hallucinations or panic attacks. While most episodes are short-lived, they can be intense enough to require medical attention. Florence remains the epicenter for reported cases, likely due to its dense concentration of Renaissance art. The Uffizi Gallery, with its famous works by Botticelli and Michelangelo, is a frequent trigger. In one notable case, a visitor reportedly collapsed in front of Botticelli's The Birth of Venus, describing an unbearable sense of beauty. Similar events have been reported at other great museums such as the Louvre and the Met. Despite its dramatic narrative, Stendhal syndrome is not universally accepted as a medical diagnosis. Critics argue that the condition is more a cultural or emotional phenomenon than a distinct psychological disorder. Some skeptics also suggest that pre-existing mental health conditions, jet lag, or cultural disorientation could explain many of the reported cases.